My name is Yahn Nemirovsky. I'm Education Coordinator for the Textile Museum of Canada. I'm joined today by Ali Davis, who is our Public Programming Assistant, and they're going to be helping out with any questions that you might have, directing me to any questions you list in the chat, because it's a lot to follow if I'm working with my hands. So thank you, Ali. And welcome to Bookbinding. This is the last workshop in our Papers and Petals series of sustainable textile teach-ins. I've had a lot of fun leading you through these workshops throughout the summer. I love working with paper. I love working with flowers. So this has been kind of like my dream, my baby project. And I have been so glad to have you join us for that. If you missed the previous workshops in the series, they're available for viewing. The recordings are available for viewing on the Textile Museum of Canada's Vimeo page. So let me know if you need help finding that, and I can send you a link. But here we are. We're going to make some books. So I invited folks to bring handmade paper that they may have made in our previous workshop if they'd like to use that for one of the techniques that we're going to be going over today. But otherwise, this is just going to be an introduction to bookbinding with stitching, rather simple, small books. And here we go. So before we start, I'd like to share the land acknowledgement for the Textile Museum of Canada. Although I'm not at the museum right now, I'm at home. I'd like to share it. So we acknowledge that the land on which the Textile Museum of Canada operates is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat. It is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Through our activities, we seek to create a space for people to share, learn, and celebrate the textile practices of today and long ago in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. So thank you all for joining us today. And let's get into it. Once again, if folks are just joining in, I invite you to keep yourself on mute unless you're asking a question or sharing a comment. I'm going to be switching back and forth between showing my face and showing my table. For the most part, I'll show my table. We can also spotlight your video if you'd like to share your work throughout the process. Some folks will find that maybe they just want to watch and listen for today, and some might want to make alongside me. So it's up to you, but the recording will be shared with you after the fact so that you can refer to the techniques we go over once again, in case it's a lot to take in to begin with. So I'm going to switch over to my table camera. Here we go. This is my table. Welcome. I'm going to share with you the materials that I have to work with today. So I have a cutting mat here. This is helpful for me because it has a ruler on it, so I can use it for reference when I'm cutting paper. It's also going to act as a surface in which I poke holes into. So when I'm poking holes through my paper to be doing my stitching for my bookbinding, I am going to want to have some kind of surface for the tip of the needle to enter that isn't just a hard tabletop. So that's helpful to me. If you don't have a cutting mat, you could perhaps use a piece of cardboard. That could work too. My little booklet is waving in the wind there of my fan. I also have a ruler. I'm going to be working with inches. I have a large needle. So this is specifically a bookbinding needle, and I got this at the art supply store called Above Ground. You can also just use an embroidery needle or any needle that has an eye large enough to fit the type of thread that you're going to be working with. Ideally, you don't want it to be a tiny, tiny sewing needle, but you work with what you have for sure. Then for my thread, there is a dedicated bookbinding thread that you can buy as well at certain places, but I would just recommend that you use a strong thread. So whether that be a synthetic sewing thread or something of a heavier weight, that's what I like to use, like a heavy cotton thread. So this looks kind of like a very thin cord, as well as this, and either one is fine. I don't have any beeswax with me today, but beeswax is very helpful for bookbinding. You would have your thread brought through the beeswax, pull it through so that the entire length of thread that you're going to be working with is waxed. And this would be helpful to you in preventing the tearing of the paper as you're doing your stitching. And as well, it would ensure that the knots that you create to be kept within your book are less likely to slip and fall out. But I don't have any wax with me today, and that's okay if you don't either. I have a pencil for making some marks. I have an Xacto knife. If you don't have an Xacto knife, you can just use scissors. There are going to be some parts of the techniques we go over today in which I will use scissors instead of an Xacto knife. It really depends on the type of paper you're working with, what kind of cutting tool you are going to want to use. Ideally, we would all have big paper cutters, just like the big guillotine paper cutters at our homes to use, because that's the most effective for bookbinding. You can make sure that all of your papers are cut at exactly the same place, but that is expensive. So here we are, we're going to be using Xacto knives and scissors unless we have access to that, and then that's great. What else am I showing you? I'm showing you some handmade paper that I have. These are examples of sheets that I made in the last Papers and Petals series workshop. And they have some nice inclusions. Some of the handmade paper that I make as it falls apart in front of me is quite weak. So I want to probably use the heavier and sturdier papers of what I made for bookbinding, just to make sure that it's not going to fall apart when I'm piercing holes in it and when I'm stitching into it. And then I have a bunch of scrap paper too. You can be making a notebook with blank paper. You can be filling a notebook with artwork. You can be doing any number of things. Whatever book you want to make, you can work with that paper. For the innards, the sort of insides of the book, I suggest that you use a rather thin paper, such as printer or photocopy paper, or like a classic sketchbook drawing paper, just because that's going to be easier to fold. You're going to get crisper fold lines than if you're working with a thick, let's say, mixed media paper or cardstock and that kind of thing. I would suggest that cardstock, mixed media paper, those are better used for the covers of a book, or perhaps for single sheet bookbinding. And I'm going to be showing you single sheet bookbinding today, because I think that that is ideal for the handmade paper, which I've invited you to bring along. So I've just got some different colors of printer paper that I'm going to be using for the insides of my book, my first book that I'm making today. And then I also have this selection of other thicker papers, textured papers, which would be great for covers or single sheet bookbinding. And the first technique that I'm going to show you today is for making a simple pamphlet. And a pamphlet is a type of book that has one signature. So a signature in bookbinding or in a book is one group of sheets that are folded and that are put into the book together as a set. So if you look at the way that a book is constructed, this is just an example. This isn't the type of book that we'll be making today, because this would take quite a long time. But this book has many signatures, which are just groupings of sheets of paper folded in half and stacked atop one another. Inside, underneath this cover, they're stitched together and then they're glued in place. We're not going to be using any glue today. We're just going to be using stitching techniques, and we're not going to do a hardcover like this. But this is just to show you an example of what signatures look like in a book stacked atop one another, so you have an understanding of that. So a pamphlet is just one signature that has a cover. This is an example of some papers that I have prepared for binding a pamphlet. So I have one cover, which is a heavier paper, and then I have my signature here, which is my thinner papers, which I will be using for the insides of the book. that one would flip through. And so all of these papers are folded in half, and then they fit within each other. And that creates the signature. Just to give you an understanding of how that works structurally. All right. And if we look at the spine of the pamphlet that I have here, you might not be able to see that so well, and even I can't see that very well, but this is a pamphlet design that has 5 holes in it. It's a 5-hole binding technique, and it's very simple. It's quite quick to do. The most time-consuming and energy-consuming part of this process is going to be cutting the paper, quite honestly, because I'm using an Xacto knife, and then the stitching will be quite quick. And I'm just seeing someone's comment. Oh, it's from Ali that they can't hear the fan. That's great. I'm glad. Good. So I'm going to move forward with showing you how to make a pamphlet, and you're welcome to follow along. If I'm going too quickly, please let me know. If you have any questions, put them in the chat or unmute yourself and ask. Please feel free to chime in. But I'm gonna start here. So what I'm gonna start with is just my printer paper. And what am I doing? What did I do for this? I did 8 inches by 6 inches for my sheets of paper. And then when folded in half, that becomes a 4-inch by 6-inch pamphlet. So those are the paper sizes that I'm going to be cutting for that. So if you'd like to follow along, you can cut pieces of paper that are 8 inches by 6 inches, just rectangles. And you can make really any number of pages in a signature that you'd like. I would suggest that you don't make it too thick if you're doing just a pamphlet. And you know, normally when a book has multiple signatures, it's so that those papers are spread out, so that they don't have anything interesting happening with their edges here. So I have cut these to sort of strategically to be existing as a sort of flat line at the side on which the pages turn here. Something that happens when you fold a bunch of papers of the exact same dimensions and encase them inside each other like this is that sometimes, well, just about all the time, the papers on the inside, you start to be able to see them in increments, maybe just a millimeter of each one on the inside of the signature, just popping out the side there. And that's because they need room to fit into the spine of the signature there. And that's called the swell. So when papers from the middle of the signature start peeking out from the side there, that's called the swell of a book or the swell of a signature. And we can prevent the swell or correct, or did I say the swell? The spell? The swell, we can correct the swell by making sure that the papers that go on the inside of our signature are just a little bit shorter. You can do this mathematically, certainly, if you work out the math for that, but I just do it by trial and error, to be quite honest, and that works fine for me. So I'm just going to move forward by cutting my first piece of paper, 8 by 6 inches. I'm using my cutting mat for reference. Which way am I going? There, I'm going that way. Okay. So I'm going to start by measuring, that's 8 inches there. So I'm going to make a cut across my paper that way. So the sheet that I'm going to be cutting out is going to be around here. It's going to be 8 by 6. I'm just cutting that out. I'm using a ruler and an Xacto knife. An Xacto knife will work fine to cut printing paper, but it might do some interesting things with a more textured paper, like a handmade paper, in that the dragging motion that you use for cutting with an Xacto knife can start to tear at the fibers of a sort of irregular paper, a paper with an irregular grain. But with printer paper, it's designed to be somewhat durable, so the dragging motion of the Xacto knife doesn't tend to tear it too easily. So it's fine to use for this. And I'm cutting 6 inches over here. And I often cut into my plastic ruler when I'm doing this. It's unfortunate, but it happens. So there's my 8-inch by 6-inch piece, and that would be folded in half to become one of the pages to go. Did I made a mistake, didn't I? Good job. I'm gonna redo that. It's so hot in my room. I'm, you know, a little bit of, it's a heat wave frazzle moment is what's happening there.
Yahn, Margaret is wondering if the swell is shorter than the signature or vice versa.
If the swell is shorter than the signature. And so Margaret, I can try and answer your question as best I can. Which one is going to stick out, the cover or the swell? So the swell sticks out from the edges of the paper. So for example, let's say this yellow paper on the inside of my signature is sticking out. That's referred to as the swell. So for anyone who's joining just now, I'd like to ask you to keep yourselves on mute unless you have a question to ask. And you're welcome to put any questions that you have into the chat. You're welcome to unmute yourself when you're asking a question or bringing up a comment or sharing your work. We're starting with making a simple pamphlet, which is a book with one signature. And we are just beginning by cutting some paper for that. So we're making 8-inch by 6-inch pieces of paper for our signature. And I'm folding this in half. And folks who've just joined, please do put any questions you have in the chat if you need some catching up. So I've done that correctly this time. My frazzled brain is awake again. Here we go. So that's one piece of paper for my signature done. Move on to another one. I choose green. Okay, and I'm going to show you an example of what that swell looks like. So the paper is on the inside of the signature sticking out a little bit. When I'm folding my paper, I'm doing my best to crease it well, either with my nail or I could use the edge of my ruler like that. Folks who do bookbinding professionally, they use a folding bone. So sometimes that's a real carved bone, or often it's just a piece of plastic that helps them get a good crease in their paper. So here you can barely see the swell, and I'll try to put that up to the camera a little bit, but there's just a bit of the green paper showing on the outside of the pink there. And that I could correct by just cutting a tiny, tiny bit, not even a millimeter, maybe just a millimeter off of each side of my piece of paper here to correct that. So I'm going to try that. Got a lovely spiral going with the paper cutting there. Very cute. And then the next one may be, you know, a piece just a bit bigger than this. I would cut off to prevent that swell from building up. And then if I try to put this piece of paper back inside here again, then hopefully that swell is eliminated, and it has been there. So they fit inside each other quite well now. I'm going to continue to cut some more pages. Maybe I'll do 5. Another that I'm just going to fold. I'm going to see how that fits into my signature here. So there is a bit of that blue showing on the outside, so I'm going to cut just about that amount off of each side of that piece of paper to prevent that from showing. So my paper is just snagged there a little bit. That's unfortunate, but I can try and correct that. So a signature is a group of pages that enters a book. And what we are working on right now is a pamphlet, which is a book that is made of just one signature. So it's a series of papers that are folded in half, and they're housed within each other and then stitched together to form a book. And if you're making a book with multiple signatures, then they would be stacked atop one another and stitched together before being entered into a case. And that would become the spine of the book, where the fold of the papers and the signatures meet. And that will be the entire. You don't want it to be too thick. If it gets to be too thick, then that's when you get to wanting to use multiple signatures. So how many have I got here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 6. 6 could be a good number. The more papers you add, the larger the swell is going to be that you're going to want to prevent, and then the less space on the actual page on the inside of the book you're going to have to fill in if it's becoming a notebook or a sketchbook. So I'd say 5, 6 would be my optimal number. And this little snag in the side of the paper here, I'm going to try and correct that by flipping my paper over and bringing my Xacto knife across it from the opposite direction. It won't completely correct it, but at least will prevent the snag from worsening. So it's got a bit of a little piece taken out there. And in that case, I might redo that page if I don't want that to be included in my book. So redo that one. And I've got a little piece of paper stuck to the end of my knife there, so I'm going to remove that to avoid more snags in my paper happening. I'm gonna try and fit this paper inside my signature and see how much I should cut off. And I'm really just eyeballing this. I don't intend to get into the math of it, though you potentially could. And then I'm just cutting off a small amount.
Hi, Yahn. Jude would like to know if you have a special technique for cutting or folding the paper.
Sure. So for cutting, one thing that I recommend that probably is one of my issues right now is that you have a very sharp blade, hopefully a newer blade so that it's not likely to snag. Techniques for cutting, I use my cutting mat for reference often when cutting a paper to size. It's helpful to have the markings on the cutting mat indicating where the inch lies so that I can use that in combination with my ruler to help me. And when I'm cutting, I hold my ruler down on my paper. I try and hold it snug against the paper, holding it down tight so that it's not going to move around while I go across with my Xacto knife. And for folding the paper, I often just do it by hand and then crease it with my nail. But you can also crease it with a ruler like that, except I just I just snagged it. It's very humid in my room. The paper, it's amazing the way that paper responds to humidity. It's absorbing all of the water in the air and it wants to move. So don't do what I just did, but you could use a nail or you could use a tool to help you crease the paper. So that's looking better. It's fitting nicely inside my signature there. I'm gonna keep going and make another page. So yeah, the way that I usually fold is I press corners together, making sure they match well. I start by creasing the center of the fold of the paper, and then with the corners down, I bring my thumbs across and get that fold across the entire length of the paper. And then I smooth it out. I crease it with my nail to make sure it is crisp. I'm gonna put that inside the signature and see how it fits. That's got quite a bit of swell, quite a bit of blue showing from inside. So I'm going to cut off about that amount on each side of the paper. And yeah, the the most labor intensive part of this process will definitely be the paper cutting, I can assure you. I think my ruler moved and my paper snagged there. Uh-oh. Okay. I'm gonna flip it around so I don't catch those same little rips the same direction. Try that. Well, you know, she's got some texture. She's not boring. I'm gonna edit that a little bit. try and fit that in my signature and see how it looks. And it's still got some texture from my cutting job, but I'm just trying to remove a bit of that, and it looks all right. The blue isn't showing so much at the edge of my signature there. I'll make one last page, and then I'll get to the cover, and then I'll get to piercing the holes for the binding. There's a bit of my cut there that's not going quite through, so I'm going to try and do this by hand and see if I can ease that across, and it worked. Great. Okay, quite a bit of the green showing there. I'm going to trim that down. Other side. And that didn't want to come all the way off. There we go. Often with a thicker paper too, you'll have to do multiple passes with the Xacto knife before it comes apart. So just maybe a first pass to trace the line, and then a second and maybe third pass to really get through the paper. I'm doing a bit of a speed run. I promise you it's not always this messy. Inching those little pieces off the edge there. All right. So a little bit of the green is still showing. Oh, no, it went away. Okay, our signature is ready. And now I'm going to work on the cover. So in this example, I chose a heavier paper for the cover, just to have a bit of a textural difference there to keep the papers inside safe. So I'm going to be using this to cut my cover from. It's already folded. It came folded when I purchased it. So I'm going to use that as reference. How tall is it? It's going to be 6 inches tall. And I'm just going to do one first pass with the Xacto knife to trace that line. And then another pass to try and dig through the paper. That came apart partially. So I'm going to just try and ease that out there. Then this is going to be cut to 8 inches, but I want to center it so that my fold is going to be at the spine of the book. So I'm going to line up my fold in the paper there. Oh, you can see my head, lovely. I'm going to line up the fold of the paper there on my cutting mat so that I know where to cut 4 inches worth on either side. So 1, 2, 3, 4 away from the fold. going to trace a line with my Xacto first. I'm going to try and get through the paper. Partially it worked. Doesn't want to let go. All right. Aha, aha, almost. Aha, nice. And then on the other side too, I'm going to measure 4 inches away from the fold. If it's helpful to you, you could be making markings with pencil for your measurements. But with my cutting mat as my guide, I don't feel that I need them. So I trace a line first and then I cut through the paper. And that felt not strong enough, so I'm going to try one more time. Oh, so close. Nice. My cover is ready. See how it fits with my signature. There's a little bit of swell there too, but I'm going to move forward with that. So that looks all right. It's going to be a little blank sketchbook. So the next thing that we're going to want to do is make markings on the inside of our signature for where we're going to place the holes. We're going to place 5 holes for this pamphlet. And to do that, I'm going to open up to the center of the signature. Then I'm going to take a scrap piece of paper and I'm going to cut it to be the same height as the fold, as the pamphlet that I'm making. So I'm just taking a scrap piece of paper. That's falling, but I'll fix it afterward. So I'm going to cut this strip of paper to be 6, right? Yes. 6 inches tall. This is going to be used as a guide for where we want to be placing the holes. So when we are binding a pamphlet and choosing where we want the outer holes to exist, you want to have them fairly close to the edge of the signature so that everything is remaining intact once it's stitched together, but not so close that there's risk of, the paper tearing or it kind of sitting funny. So what I'm going to do is probably a 1/2 inch in from either side, the top and the bottom of the signature is where my 2 outer holes are going to be pierced. So I'm going to take 1 inch off of this measuring strip, being that a 1/2 inch is taken off of each side. So now this strip indicates, once we fold it, it's going to indicate where the outer holes are going to be pierced. And then, so I'm going to fold this strip in half. And then I'm going to fold each of those sides inward towards the center fold. And this is going to be our guide for where our holes are going to be pierced in the pamphlet. So it's going to have 3 creases in it once I'm done folding it. And the 3 creases, tongue twister almost, are going to, in addition to the edges of this measuring strip, they're going to indicate where my holes are to be pierced. My 5 holes for my binding, I have measured them so that they're going to be of equal distance away from each other, but the outer holes are going to be a 1/2 inch or so away from the top and bottom of the pamphlet. So then I'm going to use my pencil to mark with little dots where I want each of my holes in my signature to be pierced. So making sure that it's aligned with the center of the length of my signature. Grab my pencil here. So then I've got 5 markings there. And for piercing the holes, ideally you would use something called an awl, which is a tool with a pointy edge, a metal pointy edge. Often it has a wooden handle and a long sort of probe. And that would be the most comfortable tool to use for piercing holes when bookbinding. But what you can use alternatively, and what I'm going to use, is just my same bookbinding needle. This is going to be an instance in which having a cutting mat or a cardboard surface underneath your signature, that will be helpful. It'll provide somewhere for the point of the needle to go, and it'll allow you the opportunity to put pressure on the paper when piercing through it, so that there's something somewhat soft that the needle there's somewhere somewhat soft that the needle has to go. And sometimes you have to pierce a few pages at a time, and then you can use the previously pierced pages as reference. So for example, I could pierce this center page of the signature first, and maybe once I've got my needle on that point, I could use something heavy to apply some pressure. I'm using a pair of scissors. I'm breaking every craft rule as I intend to do in my life and my practice. Fabric scissors for a paper project, and not even on the paper, used as a hammer even. Great stuff. So once I've got the sort of point marked in each of those markings, I can put the needle all the way through each of those holes to make sure I've got that prepared for the stitching, and to make sure I've got a good guide to go forward with in making holes in the rest of the papers for the signature. So that's ready. And then I'm going to pierce through 2 papers underneath that at the same time. I'm going to try and line them up as best I can using my thumbs, making sure that their folded edges are sitting nicely within each other, and that the tops and bottoms are lined up as well with the sides of my hands like that. And then as carefully as I can, I'm going to set that down and then pierce those holes that same way. And we want them to be in ideally the exact same place on every piece of paper in the signature, so that they will sit together nicely and stitch together without any tears. Readjust your paper if it's moving while you're using your scissors as a hammer. Hopefully those are all marked in the pages underneath, and they are. I want to make sure I don't lose track of the order of my pages here since I spent so much time considering the swell and how they fit together. I'm just pulling the needle through all of those holes. I could do this through both pages at the same time if I wanted to be efficient about it. I guess I did it. Put that back in there so I remember that it goes there. Put that back in there. And then I'm going to do these two pages at the same time and then do my cover on its own afterward. And let's see if this one's good enough to be used as a model. Yes, I'm going to say yes. Okay, I'm lining up my papers at their folds. Okay, let's see if I can pierce through the two behind at the same time. Yes, lovely. You could honestly try doing this piercing for the entire signature at once if you feel confident in doing that. Okay, and I'm going to put my center pages back inside. That's all pierced together nicely. Now it's time for the cover. I'm going to use the last largest piece as my reference for piercing holes in the cover. Centering that against the fold. And that's all ready. All right, it's time to sew a book. Here we go. So I'm going to use the same needle that's just been through so much and put it through some more. And I'm going to get my thread out. So I've got this heavy thread to use. It's very sturdy. It's not going to break on me. You can use synthetic sewing thread that's going to be strong if you don't have a thicker thread like this, or you could also use this quite thick kind of thread here. There's dedicated bookbinding thread that you can find, which is often overpriced, but it works well. So I'm going to measure a piece of thread that is 3 times the length of my spine, and then a bit more because I feel that I need that just to be secure with myself. And so that's 3. And I'm going to add some more just for fun, just in case. Where's my other pair of scissors? Here we go. And it's very strong thread. So the classic way that one would secure thread to a needle for bookbinding, I'm going to show you, but it won't work if you have, if you're using a sewing thread, like a machine sewing thread that's very thin. This technique will only work if you have a thicker thread. So I'll show you this, and then if you can't do this, what I recommend is just tying a knot to secure the thread to the needle just there, and not worrying about this little tail here. But to secure it for bookbinding, what is done is you take the tail after you've threaded the needle and you put the needle through the thread, actually physically through the thread in the tail. And I'm being quite dangerous here, having it right over my finger. Perhaps you want to use a thimble or something, but my needle is here. Where's my camera here? My needle is going through my thread. And I'm going to pull it, creates a loop, and then it's going to be very secure. It's not going to come off unless I cut it. So that's ready. Oh, I just lied. That's so funny. I just said that and then it didn't work. Okay, let's do it again. Good thing I cut extra thread. So in theory, it wouldn't have come off. Perhaps if I used beeswax to wax my thread, it would have stayed better. Here we go. Let's go through. Let's give it a bigger tail. Okay. Good. I tested it too hard. All right. Like a Dairy Queen when they show you the blizzard upside down, except this time it fell. Hello.
Yahn, Margaret is wondering if the number of holes represent the type of book you're making, and could you use a smaller number of holes if you wanted?
So for a pamphlet, you can do a variety of a different number of holes. The technique is going to change slightly, like the order of stitching is going to change slightly. I am showing this 5-hole demonstration and the order associated with that. But you could certainly look up, the order of stitching for a 3-hole pamphlet, maybe a 4-hole pamphlet. And honestly, once you get the hang of it, you can kind of intuitively perhaps choose how to arrange the order of stitching in order to accomplish what you're looking for. What determines this to be a pamphlet is just that it's made with one single signature, and the number of holes does not contribute to that definition. So I've got my thread secured to the needle, and I'm ready to be stitching. I'm going to start by passing my needle through the center hole from the inside of the signature opened up at the center page here. I'm going to pass my needle all the way through in the center hole, and this might take some arranging to get all of them lined up at where that hole is pierced. So I've got my needle going through there. I'm going to leave a tail on the inside of the book there to be used for tying a knot at the end of the process, and just maybe hold it secure with my thumb if it is slipping or anything. And then the next thing I'm going to do is enter the hole that is one below where I've come out in the center. I'm looking at the cover of the book, the spine, the outer spine, and I'm going to enter the hole just below and go through all of the pages back into that center fold sheet. And try and make that somewhat taut and secure. You want to be a little bit careful with, there's always risk of ripping the papers. For example, if I were to pull really sharply in this direction with this thread here, then there's a risk that this would tear. It's best when you're pulling at the thread in your bookbinding to pull with the thread lined up against the spine. So I'm going to now enter this hole at the bottom of my signature here, all the way through the cover. And we'll be sort of doing a crisscross, kind of like a giant back stitch of sorts for this stitching technique. And it's taking a bit of pressure to get that needle through there, making sure all those holes are lined up. So, and then I pull that taut and it sits flat as a stitch on the inside of my book. I'll have to continue to pull things taut as I work, and especially at the end when I'm tying the knot to secure the work. After I have done that stitch and come out at the bottom of my cover, I'm then going to go back into this hole, which is one above where I've just come out. So we've previously entered this, but now I'm going to enter it again, then completing this stitch. So then on the outer, on the cover, we see 2 stitches side by side there. And then on the inside, we see 1 stitch completed and our thread coming out one side of it. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to not go in here. I'm going to skip that, and I'm going to enter the hole above it and come through to the other side. Make sure it's not caught on my corner like it just did. It just was. All right, and then once I'm out here, what am I going to do? I'm going to go this way. I'm going to go through the top hole. And it's fighting me a little bit here. All right. And then what I'm going to do is go through this second hole from the top, completing this area that's missing some thread. And then if I look on the other side, there is one area lacking thread, so I'm going to enter the middle hole there, and that's where my thread is going to meet the tail from where I started the stitching, and that's where I'm going to tie a knot. So at this point, I want to be making sure that my stitches are snug, and you can sort of pull at previous stitches a little bit with your fingers and shift things around so that everything is sitting flat and snug. And then I'm going to tie a knot. And this is another one of those situations in which having waxed thread is helpful. It helps for knots to stay well in place and not slip. So I'm tying a couple of knots there, and I might do a third really to secure all of the stitching. And then if you'd like, you can weave this through previous stitches to kind of somewhat conceal that thread on the inside of your signature there, or you can just cut it with little tails. It's kind of cute. There are some pamphlet designs that rather than having started from the center, the inside of the book, you would start from the outside, and then your knot becomes a bow, something decorative. But for this workshop, I've just done one where it's in the center, and you won't see it until you get to that center page when you're flipping through the book. So this pamphlet is done. It has 4 stitches showing on the inside, on the outside, sorry, on the cover. If we flip through it, this is what it looks like. We can see a little bit where the stitches are existing, and it's ready to go. and I feel good about it. It's cute. All right. So now what I'm going to begin to show you is binding with single sheets. So this is a technique that works better or works best for thicker papers, for handmade paper, something that maybe it's more fragile, maybe it's too thick to be folding well, something that you want to be stitching with each separate page almost acting as its own signature. So it's as if we're going to be binding a book with multiple signatures, but really each signature is just its own page. So this is an example of some handmade paper that I have made, and I have cut it to what size, 3¼ inch by 5, because that's the size that just worked for me. I was trying to avoid some weaker areas of the paper that I made that were just a result of, you know, a non-regular sort of outline to the page. So I determined that 3¼ by 5 was the best size for me to move forward with the paper that I'd made. I have lined it with washi tape. This isn't necessary, but it's something that I thought would be necessary for my own handmade paper because I found that it was actually not the sturdiest. And that's probably because I was working with quite large pieces of paper for my pulp when making my own handmade paper. So you could consider using washi tape to line the edges of the sheets that you'd like to be binding with so that it's less likely that there will be any tearing. It'll be bound together stronger. So in addition to this handmade paper, I will be using some other thicker sheets of paper. How big is this? This will work. I'm going to try just doing 4 sheets, just to give you a sense of what this technique is all about. For this type of binding, I'm going to be using 6 holes in total. There are 3 in the top of the page and 3 in the bottom of the page. They're set in a bit from the left side of the page and upward from the bottom and downward from the top. And they are a 1/2 inch apart, these holes. And I'm going to now cut some other pages to bind to this handmade paper to make a tiny little book here. If I'm going to be cutting handmade paper, what I would do is I would use my ruler and I would use a pencil to mark the line that I'd like to cut, and then I would cut it with scissors. And that's because, and maybe I can show you a little bit here, using an Xacto knife on handmade paper that is this fragile will definitely have it tear because the grain line is not consistent, because there is so much happening with the pulp there. So cutting this with an Xacto knife will be somewhat disastrous. So I do suggest, if it's very fragile, to mark it with a pencil using a ruler and then cut it by hand with scissors. And that will prevent the tearing from happening. But with this paper, it's very strong. It's commercially made. I can tell that it'll be fine with an Xacto knife. So I'm doing 3¼ by 5. So there are lots of different bookbinding techniques that you can get into, even just with stitching and not even using any glue. There are stab binding techniques, which are like the one that we're going to be taking on now, where there are holes in the surface of the sheets of paper being used, and then binding techniques that have the holes in the folds along the spine of the signatures and the spine of the book are referred to as saddle stitching techniques. Okay, so that's all ready. And then I'm going to, well, first I'm going to tell you the dimensions that I used for this. So here I have my notes with me because it got very specific for no particular reason. I was 5/16 of an inch away from the side, marking this hole, and I was 3/8 of an inch away from the top. And I just decided that based on what I thought was relevant for the size of the book that I'm making. Often folks will use like a standard sort of measurement of a 1/2 inch, but a 1/2 inch was going to be quite into the general content area of my page there. So I wanted to have it a bit closer to the edge, but not so close that there was going to be risk of tearing. So that's why I decided that. And I've got 3 holes here, 3 holes here, and these are 1/2 inch spaced here. There's just an open space in the middle there that will just do its own thing. Using my needle again to mark these holes with my previously pierced page as a reference. I lost my awl somewhere. It's quite sad. I think they have them for quite cheap at Leather Supply on Spadina if you're in Toronto. But you can also likely find them at many craft stores. I'm going to pierce through this. Do folks want to share in the chat if you're comfortable with it, where you're joining us from, actually? It's always fun to know. Who are reaching. I'm in Toronto. Use this as a reference to pierce some more holes in the next page. That moved. Voila, done. Okay. Now that's ready to be bound. So single sheet binding is quite interesting in that each hole is going to require its own line of thread. And I have heard from folks that the recommended length for thread for this technique is multiplying the length of your book by the number of sheets that you're working with. So here it's 4, and then I'll add a little bit more after that. And it's not quite exact measurements here. I just always want to make sure I have extra in case something goes wrong, or in case there's a road bump, you know. I've seen folks who use 6 needles at a time to do this technique, and I don't have 6 needles of this width to be working with, so I'm going to use one and just take it out of one thread and put it in another. If you have 6 needles, then maybe you can move forward doing that. There's 1, there's 2, there's 3, there's 4. And we're running so short on time that I'm going to get to this technique rather than cutting the rest of the threads. Okay. So how I'm going to start is I'm going to say that this is my back cover and this is my front cover of my book. I'm going to enter first hole. I'm going to leave a bit of a tail and then tie a knot with it. This is another one of those situations where having wax thread is helpful. If folks have any questions that they haven't brought up during the workshop and that they'd like to bring forward with me, you can send me an email. You can respond to the reminder emails that I sent out, and I will get back to you with that. So I've tied a knot there, and you can just trim this thread if you'd like. Okay. I lied. This is the page before my cover. Sometimes I have to remember this with muscle memory in order to get it right. This is the page before my cover. And in order to fasten my cover with this first line of stitching here, I'm going to enter the cover underneath this page from the back. If my needle will go through. And I'm going to make sure that my needle is on the left side of that loop that's created. I'm going to pull that snug. And then what I'm going to do is pass my needle underneath the little stitches that are created there to secure it. So that fastening is done for that one. Then I'm going to take my needle off and I'm going to move on to the next thread, secure another knot there the same way. So I'm entering from the top of the second to last page here, or what is to be the second to last page of my completed book. Tying a knot around it. I've not gone through the back cover, I've just gone through the hole in the second to last page there. Second knot to secure it. And then I'm trimming it. I'll try and make sure that's tight, which it's not. It's not. Okay.
Yahn, will there be a knot on each of the signature holes?
Yes, there will be. For this technique, there will be. Thank you. Okay, And then I'm going to enter into just the hole in the back cover. I'm going to try and show you what that looks like. Where is the camera? From the bottom and come out in between these sheets and make sure that my needle is on the left side of the loop that I have created there. And then pass my needle underneath the stitches that have been created. And I will continue doing that. I guess I'll show you what it looks like to finish this off, even though I won't do all the stitches all the way across. I will just show you what it looks like to attach another sheet and then attach the cover. So I'm going to thread my needle at the first thread again to show you what it looks like to put another page on. So when I'm adding pages, after I've got the second to last page in the back cover secured, I'm now going to start entering the holes from the top of the page and just through that hole, and then keep my needle on the left side of the loop created. And pull that taut. And then I'm going to enter under the stitch that I just created there with my needle. And then one additional step for all of these pages to make up the middle of the book is I'm going to pass my needle underneath the stitch between the previous two pages. So here, in this case, it's the second to last page and the back cover. I'm passing my needle in between. I'm not sure if you can see that, in between those stitches, and that's just an additional means of securing that. And you would continue to do that for all pages in the center of the book, securing them that way. And then to attach the final cover, I'm going to do the same thing for what I would do for adding a new page in the center by entering the top of the page there, having my needle on the left side of the loop created, pulling that taut, and passing underneath this stitch with my needle, and then passing under the previous stitch created between the previous two pages as a means of securing it. I'm going to pass it a second time for the cover to keep the cover a little bit extra secure. And then this time I'm going to enter the book in between the cover and the page before that. With my thread, I'm going to pass my needle under the stitch on this page here. And I'm going to tie a knot, and I'm going to tie a couple of knots actually to secure that. So you would do this process for all of the stitching according to each of those holes for the entire book. And that's a single sheet binding. And here I would just trim my thread and then each of the holes will have this binding that is just visible from the side with here. the camera angle is difficult to become accustomed to. The stitches on the side are visible, and then just one stitch on the front there, one stitch on the back. That would be the same all the way down the spine. And that's what that looks like. And we're just about finished up. And thank you so much, Ali, for helping with these questions. And the pages do fold open, yes. So they will all be attached in this way, and then they open quite flat. So I hope that you had a nice introduction to making a pamphlet. I did my best to squeeze in single sheet binding in there. I realized it was rushed. I apologize for that. I hope that in watching the recording of this workshop, you'll have the opportunity to take that on and maybe review it and look at it in more detail to be able to find some books with some handmade paper and thicker papers. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Please reach out with any questions you have. If you create any projects that you'd like to share with me, I'd love to see photos. I'd always love to receive that. And I'm also going to be sharing a survey for receiving your feedback on your experience with the workshop, because we always appreciate hearing from you about that. And I'll share a little bit about sustainable textile teachings that are going to be taking place now that this Papers and Petals series is done. So we're moving forward with a series of mending workshops, and we're going to be starting with a workshop focusing on sewing techniques. So relating to fixing hems, fixing zippers, sewing buttons, and that kind of thing, hand sewing. So I hope you'll join us for that in September. And I will share a link to register for that once it's available.